The river never forgot. Its steady song drifted across the valley, carrying whispers of secrets and childhood promises. On long summer days, the water glimmered like silver, and on quiet nights, it mirrored the wide western sky. It was beside that river, under the shade of cottonwood trees, that a little girl of 8 had stood on her toes, brushed her lips against the cheek of a cowboy twice her age, and whispered a vow that would one day change both their lives. No one else had seen it, and no one would have believed such a small moment could hold the weight of destiny. But for her, it wasn't a childish gesture, it was the beginning of a promise she intended to keep. Back then, the cowboy had laughed. He had been a boy himself, not yet hardened by dust and work, not yet carrying the burden of a man's pride. His hat was too big for his head, his boots scuffed from hand-me-down use. He had teased her for being bold, yet the look in his eyes had softened in a way that stayed etched in her memory. She remembered the smell of wild sage drifting on the wind, the way the sun caught his hair, the nervous flutter in her chest when he didn't pull away. It was a moment stamped into the rhythm of the land, as unshakable as the mountains on the horizon. In those days, promises were more than words. Folks in the old American towns measured a person by the strength of their word, by the grit in their handshake, by the way they carried themselves when no one was watching. And the little girl who had kissed the cowboy by the river believed her promise was as strong as steel. She told him she would find him again in 10 years, and that when she did, neither the river nor the passing of time would erase what was meant to be. The years that followed were not kind to anyone. The land itself carried hardship, with storms sweeping across the plains and winters that bit into bone. Families moved, crops failed, cattle died, and still the cowboy grew into his own. By the time a decade had stretched its way through, he was no longer a boy with hand-me-down boots. He had become a man with broad shoulders, a weathered hat, and eyes that had seen too much for his age. The world had shaped him with dust, sweat, and long hours under the sun. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, in the silence of twilight rides, he remembered the girl and the promise she made beside the river. For her, the promise was not a childhood fancy, it was her anchor. While others mocked her dreams or told her that the world didn't care for promises made by children, she held fast to that memory. She grew into a young woman with fire in her heart, her spirit carried by the same restless wind that whispered through the grasslands. Every step she took, every plan she made, circled back to that day by the river. To her, keeping her word was not only about love, it was about proving that some things in this changing world could still stand unbroken. The town itself bore witness to the years. It was the kind of place where church bells rang on Sundays, where saloon doors creaked through the night, and where the streets turned muddy after rain. Folks talked more than they should, and secrets rarely stayed buried long. The cowboy's name carried through those streets sometimes with respect, sometimes with envy, and sometimes with bitterness. He had carved a life for himself with the strength of his hands, and though people admired him, they also whispered about the shadows that clung to his past. There were stories of fights he had won, debts he had settled, and choices that had left scars. He was no longer the laughing boy by the river, and anyone who crossed his path could see it. Yet he remembered, and she was coming. The land itself seemed to anticipate her return. The air carried a restlessness in the weeks leading up to the 10th year. The cottonwoods by the river grew heavy with green, and the water sang louder, as if waiting for the reunion it had promised to hold. She rode back into the valley with the determination of someone who had carried a secret for too long. Her eyes searched the horizon, and her heart beat with the rhythm of a vow she had never broken. But promises are rarely simple. She soon learned that the man she came back for was no longer waiting in the same place she had left him. He was not only changed by time, but entangled in troubles that ran deeper than gossip or grudges. He carried enemies as much as he carried friends, and the weight of choices pressed heavy on his shoulders. To find him meant stepping into his world, a world far harsher than the innocence of childhood had prepared her for. The river still flowed, its current stronger than before, as if reminding her that time never truly pauses. Standing at its edge once more, she whispered the same words she had spoken a decade earlier. The memory of that first kiss burned in her mind, but so did the unknown of what waited now. 10 years had turned a boy into a man, and a girl into a woman. And the distance between them was filled with more than miles. It was filled with unspoken truths, buried pain, and the question of whether a promise could truly outlast the storms of life. She thought of the stories she had heard since her return. Whispers of the cowboy facing off against rival ranchers, of debts he had paid with blood, of a heart that no longer trusted easily. Some folks said he was too dangerous now, too hardened, while others claimed he was the only man in the county worth trusting when the chips were down. Everyone had their own version of him, but she held on to the memory of the boy by the river, the one who hadn't pulled away, the one who had laughed with warmth in his eyes, the one who had unknowingly tied his future to hers with that single fleeting moment. The town watched her as she walked its streets, curious about the young woman with determination carved into her stride. They didn't know her story, but they could sense she was searching for something or someone that mattered more than anything else. Whispers followed her, but she paid them no mind. She had come for one reason, and she wouldn't leave until she found him. The days stretched and tension thickened. The closer she came to him, the more the obstacles rose. The river's song grew louder in her ears, reminding her of the promise that brought her here. Yet each step revealed how much the world had changed since that day. When at last she caught sight of him from afar, standing tall beneath the western sun, her heart nearly faltered. He was not the boy she remembered. He was a man forged by battles, with a face marked by both strength and sorrow. And as their eyes met for the first time in 10 years, the air between them carried both recognition and distance. The promise she had carried for a decade hung heavy in the silence. And the question rose like a storm between them. Would he even want her to keep it now? The river sang on, waiting for the answer. The silence that stretched between them was heavier than the sound of church bells on Sunday morning. She stood rooted to the dirt road, her hands curled into fists at her sides, watching the cowboy she had waited 10 years to see. Didn't move at first, just tipped his hat back slightly, squinting against the afternoon sun. His eyes were darker than she remembered, carved by miles of hard living and too many days spent under the open sky. For a moment she wondered if he even recognized her, or if she had turned into nothing more than a ghost from his past. The air carried the sharp scent of dust, leather, and horse sweat. Behind him, the ranch stretched wide, fences running like scars across the land. Barns patched with weathered boards, cattle scattered in the distance. It was the kind of place that told stories without words, stories of labor, grit, and a man's will to survive. But it also told another story, one she could feel in the way his shoulders carried an invisible weight. He had built something here, yet it didn't look like peace. She wanted to run up and close the distance, to remind him of the river, the promise, the moment that had anchored her heart for a decade. She didn't. Something in his stance warned her that the man before her was not the boy she remembered. The boy had been warm, playful, quick to laugh. The man looked like someone who had fought for every inch of his place in the world. He finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You've grown." The words were simple, but they carried an edge that cut deep. She nodded, her throat tight. "And you've changed." Neither said the word that hovered between them. Promise. She had spent years dreaming of this moment, of what it would feel like to see him again. She had pictured him smiling, maybe teasing her the way he once had, but reality was different. He was guarded, his gaze cautious, as if she were someone who might tip the fragile balance of his life, and she knew instantly that whatever awaited her here, it would not be easy. The town had whispered plenty before she returned. Stories of the cowboy's rise, of rival ranchers who tried to take him down, of nights when gunfire cracked through the dark. They said he was fair, but feared, a man who kept his word, but never forgot a betrayal. Some admired him, others warned to stay away, but no one denied he had become a force in the valley. She wondered what it had cost him, and if beneath that hard shell was still the boy she once kissed by the river. She broke the silence. "Do you remember?" He looked at her for a long while, his jaw tightening. She didn't know if he was searching for the memory or for the strength to admit it. Finally, he turned his gaze to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to sink behind the ridges. A lot can happen in 10 years. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it wasn't a denial either. The words hung between them, a barrier she couldn't cross. She realized then that if she wanted to keep her promise, she'd have to fight for it. Not against him, but against everything that had built up around him over the years. That night, she stayed in a small room above the general store. The bed creaked, the walls were thin, and the smell of old pine filled the air. She lay awake listening to the muffled sounds of boots on wooden floors and voices drifting up from the saloon across the street. The town was alive with its own rhythm, but her mind kept circling back to him. His face, his voice, the distance in his eyes had all tangled into a knot she couldn't undo. She thought of the river again, of the way the water had sparkled when she made her vow. She had carried that promise through every hardship, through years of waiting, and now it stood before her like a locked door. The question was whether he wanted her to open it, or if he had already thrown away the key. The next day, she walked the town streets, and everywhere she went, eyes followed. The shopkeeper asked where she had come from. The blacksmith gave her a nod that carried more curiosity than kindness. Even the children playing marbles in the dust paused to watch her pass. She wasn't just another face in town people could sense. She was tied to the cowboy, though no one knew how. By the time she reached the saloon, she had already heard fragments of stories. Men spoke of rival ranches trying to steal cattle. Women whispered of fights that ended with bruises and broken pride. Someone mentioned debts. Someone else mentioned loyalty. And through it all, the cowboy's name surfaced again and again. He was at the center of everything, both respected and feared. And now, she was tangled in it too, simply by coming back. When she saw him later that afternoon, he was leading a horse toward the corral. His hands were steady, his movements sure, but his eyes flicked up when he caught sight of her. She stepped closer, her boots crunching in the dirt. "I kept my word," she said softly. Tied the reins with practiced skill before facing her, "And what do you expect me to do with that?" The question caught her off guard. She had always imagined he would welcome her, that he would understand the weight of what she had carried. But his voice wasn't cruel, it was weary, as though he bore more battles than anyone could see. "I don't expect," she answered after a pause. "I just came back like I said I would." For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite sorrow, but something human that cracked the mask he wore. He studied her as if trying to decide whether her return was a gift or a burden. The sun dipped lower, painting the land in gold. Shadows stretched long, and the river's song carried faintly in the distance. She could feel the weight of time pressing on them both, the 10 years that had carved two different paths, now colliding once more. She had found him, but finding him was only the beginning. What she didn't know yet was how much danger lurked in the life he had built. The rival ranchers hadn't forgotten their grudges, and the debts he had paid in blood had left scars that were far from healed. By coming back, by stepping into his world, she had placed herself in the middle of storms that could break them both. Still, she stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. The promise she carried was not just about the past, it was about the future she refused to let go of. Thawed, and though he didn't say it, though the words never crossed his lips, she could see it in the way he looked at her now. He remembered. The question was no longer whether he recognized her, but whether he would let himself believe in promises again. The river kept flowing, the land kept breathing, and the tension between them grew like a storm waiting to break. When he finally turned away, leading the horse back to the barn, she knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere in the silence, between the shadows and the dust, the past and the present had collided. And as night settled over the valley, one thing became clear: the promise that had carried her across 10 years was about to be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. The story of the girl who kissed the cowboy by the river was far from over, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The nights in the valley were never truly quiet. Crickets sang in the grass, coyotes called from the hills, and the river kept its steady rhythm. But for her, the loudest sound was the silence that stretched between her and the cowboy. Each time she saw him, she felt the distance as sharply as a knife. He spoke little, his words clipped and careful, as though he feared that saying too much might invite a kind of weakness he could not afford. She had returned with fire in her chest, holding on to the promise she made when she was 8. But she soon realized that her return stirred more than memories. It stirred old grudges, unsettled jealous hearts, and reopened wounds that had never healed. The conflict began to show itself in whispers. At the saloon, rough voices muttered that the cowboy's ranch had no right to claim the stretch of grazing land by the river. A rival family, the Keatings, had been eyeing it for years. They were men with money and a mean streak, the kind who didn't mind twisting the law to get what they wanted. Folks in town spoke of fences cut in the night, cattle stolen, and hired guns lurking on the roads. The cowboy had fought them off before, but the feud was far from over. And now her presence gave them something new to use against him. She felt the weight of those stares when she walked into town. Women at the mercantile whispered behind their hands, wondering who she was to the cowboy. Men at the blacksmith shop looked her over too long, their smirks sharp with questions. Even the preacher's wife gave her a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. It wasn't only curiosity, it was suspicion. They sensed she was tied to him, and in this place, ties could be dangerous. But she refused to back down. Each morning, she rode out along the edge of the river, breathing in the smell of sage and dust, reminding herself why she had come. She wanted to see if the boy she once knew was still hidden beneath the hardened man. She wanted to keep her word, yet the more she searched, the more she saw the shadows that clung to him. At night, when the saloon's piano played and the laughter spilled into the street, she sometimes caught sight of him standing apart from the crowd, leaning against the wooden post with his hat pulled low. Why he watched everything, spoke to few, and left before the night grew too loud. He carried himself like a man ready for a fight, but she noticed the moments when his shoulders sagged just slightly.
Ow.
When his guard slipped and the weight of years showed on his face. It was in those moments she recognized him, the boy by the river who once laughed so freely. The tension grew sharper when she overheard talk of a coming showdown. The Keatings were not content to play games in the dark. They wanted his ranch, his land, and they were ready to push harder. There were rumors of bribes offered to town officials, of threats made against those who stood by him. And though no one said it outright, she understood what it meant. Trouble was coming, and trouble in this valley usually carried the sound of gunfire. She tried to ask him about it one evening. He was repairing a fence near the barn, his hands steady as he worked, sweat darkening his shirt. She stood nearby, waiting for him to look up, but he didn't. Finally, she asked, "Is it true what they're saying in town?" He kept his eyes on the fence post. "Gah, depends on what they're saying. That the Keatings won't stop until they take everything you've built." He paused then, hammer in hand, and finally looked at her. His eyes were hard, but not unkind. "They've been trying for years. They'll keep trying until they get what they want, or until someone stops them." "Then let me help," she said before she could stop herself. His jaw tightened. "This isn't your fight." "It is," she replied, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. "It became mine the day I made that promise." For a moment something flickered in his gaze, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He turned back to the fence. Promises don't win wars. The sting of his words stayed with her, but so did the fire they sparked. She couldn't walk away, not now. Not when the land itself seemed to be holding its breath. She decided then that if he wouldn't let her in, she would find her own way to stand beside him. In the days that followed, she began to learn more about the people who circled around him. There was the old ranch hand, a man with silver in his hair and stories etched into his face, who had been with the cowboy since his first herd. He spoke little, but his loyalty was written in the way he worked without question. There was also a young boy, no older than 16, who idolized the cowboy and followed him like a shadow, eager to prove himself. She saw how the cowboy treated both with the same quiet respect, though he never said much. And then there were those who circled from the outside. She met a woman at the general store, sharp-eyed and bitter, who hinted at a history with him. She didn't speak his name, but her tone carried enough to let her know that the cowboy's past was not free of tangled ties. It was another reminder that 10 years was a long time, long enough for wounds and regrets to take root. One evening, as she walked along the riverbank, she found a mark carved into a tree she remembered from childhood. It was old and faint, but she recognized it, the initials of a boy and a girl who once stood beneath the cottonwoods. Her chest tightened as she traced the letters with her fingertips. The memory of that kiss, of that promise, felt alive again, but it was wrapped now in the knowledge of the man he had become. She realized that to keep her word meant more than simply returning it, meant stepping into the life he lived now, a life full of danger, enemies, and choices that could break them both. The river whispered its steady song, and she closed her eyes. She had no doubt the Keatings would strike soon. The tension in town was too sharp, the air too heavy with expectation. She didn't know when or how, but she could feel it coming. And when it did, she would be there not just as the girl who once made a promise, but as the woman who intended to keep it. Still, questions pressed at her heart. Would he let her stand beside him when the storm broke, or would he push her away to protect her? Would the promise she carried be strong enough to bridge the years between them, or had time carved a gap too wide to cross? The answers remained hidden, buried in the silence of a man who had learned to guard himself too well. As the sun set that night, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold, she stood at the river's edge once more. The current pulled strong, carrying with it the weight of time, of memories, of unspoken words. Somewhere behind her, in the distance, came the faint sound of hooves, steady, deliberate, like a warning. The valley was waiting. The storm was near. And the promise that had carried her back was about to be tested against more than just the years. It would be tested against the very dangers that shaped the cowboy into the man he had become. The nights grew longer, and the shadows in the valley stretched wider. Every corner of the town seemed to carry a warning, and though no one spoke it plainly, everyone knew the Keatings were close to making their move. The air carried a heaviness, as if the land itself was bracing for the storm. She felt it in her chest, the same way she felt the river's pull each time she stood by its edge. The promise that had carried her back had brought her into the heart of a conflict she could no longer step away from. The cowboy grew quieter as the days passed, his eyes sharper, his movements more guarded. He had always been a man of few words, but now silence wrapped around him like armor. She saw him checking fences long after dark, his hand never far from the revolver at his side. She noticed the way the ranch hands carried themselves differently, too. Glancing over their shoulders as though danger could step out from the shadows at any moment. She wanted to reach him, to remind him of the boy she once knew, but each time she tried, he pulled back. He was polite, sometimes even gentle, but there was a wall between them now, one built from years of hardship and choices he couldn't undo. Still, she refused to give up. The promise wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to both of them, even if he wouldn't say it aloud. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she overheard voices at the saloon. Rough, low, and sharp, the words carried clearly through the open windows. The Keatings were planning something big, a raid on the cowboy's ranch meant to drive him off the land once and for all. She froze in the shadows, her heart pounding as the details spilled out: men on horseback, coming under the cover of night, ready to set fire to the barns and scatter the cattle. They meant to leave nothing standing. She rushed to warn him, breathless as she told him what she had heard. He listened in silence, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with the quiet fury of a man who had expected this moment all along. When she finished, he tipped his hat low and said only, "I figured they'd come sooner or later. That doesn't mean you should face them alone," she said, her voice trembling. He met her gaze then, steady and unflinching. "This land's mine to defend, always has been, always will be. But you're not alone anymore," she whispered. The weight of her words lingered in the air. For the first time, she thought she saw the wall around him crack, if only for a heartbeat. His jaw tightened, and he looked away as though admitting the truth of her words would make him vulnerable. That night, the ranch prepared for the storm. The old ranch hand checked rifles, his hands steady despite his years. The young boy who followed the cowboy around polished his boots, too eager to hide his fear. She tried to help where she could, carrying water, steadying horses, and moving supplies. But inside she fought against her own dread. She had wanted to keep her promise, to stand beside him, but now she understood what that truly meant. Promises weren't forged in quiet moments by the river. They were tested in fire, in danger, in the choice to stay when it would be easier to run. The night dragged, heavy with waiting. The sky stretched wide and starless, the moon hidden behind clouds. She stood at the window of her small room, staring across the darkened valley, listening for the sound of hooves. When it came, it was faint at first, like a distant echo, then louder, then closer. The cowboy was already outside when she rushed down. He stood tall in the yard, rifle in hand, his hat casting a shadow across his face. The ranch hands gathered around him, tense and ready, their eyes fixed on the ridge where the sound grew stronger. The ground trembled with the weight of approaching riders. She felt her breath catch as shapes appeared in the distance, torches flickering like angry stars against the black sky. The Keatings had come. Dozens of them, mounted and armed, their voices carrying on the wind. The flames of their torches lit the night, casting wild shadows across the land. For a moment, everything seemed to hold still. The cowboy's voice broke the silence, low and calm. "Hold your ground." The ranch hands tightened their grips, the young boy's face pale but determined. She stood just behind them, her heart hammering, refusing to be pushed aside. She had promised, and this was where her promise led her. The riders drew closer, the thunder of hooves filling the valley. She could see their faces now, hard, cruel, and set with determination. The Keatings weren't here to scare anyone. They were here to end it. One of them shouted, his voice rough and full of mockery. "Time to hand over the land, cowboy, or we'll burn it to the ground." The cowboy didn't flinch. His voice carried steady through the night. "This land isn't yours to take." A tense silence followed, the kind that stretched like a bowstring ready to snap. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest, every second sharper than the last. The riders shifted, their horses restless, the torches spitting sparks into the wind. She knew the first shot, the first move, would shatter everything. She glanced at him then, at the man she had come back for. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with the same fire she remembered from years ago, hidden behind laughter and innocence. It wasn't just a man fighting for land. He was fighting for his name, his pride, and the life he had carved out of this hard soil. Her breath caught as the first torch arced through the air, flying toward the barn. Flames licked the dry wood, crackling as smoke began to rise. The Keatings let out a cheer, their voices wild, and in that instant the valley erupted into chaos. Shots cracked through the night, the sound echoing against the hills. Horses screamed, men shouted, the smell of smoke and gunpowder thick in the air. She ducked behind the fence, her heart pounding, watching as the cowboy raised his rifle and fired with calm precision. He moved like a man born to this moment, steady and unyielding, but the numbers were against him. The young boy clutched his rifle too tightly, his hands shaking. The old ranch hand fought with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. She wanted to run to them, to help, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. All she could do was watch, her promise burning in her chest like fire, as the night tore itself apart around them. The river's song drifted faintly through the chaos, a reminder of the vow that had brought her here. She thought of the boy she had kissed, of the man he had become, and of the storm that was now breaking over both their heads. Smoke filled the air, sparks flying as the barn roared with flames. The ranch yard was a blur of shadows and firelight, the line between friend and enemy blurred in the frenzy of the fight. She could see the cowboy, tall and unyielding, standing his ground as the riders closed in. And in that moment, as the fire raged and the valley trembled, she realized the promise she carried was not only about love, it was about survival. It was about proving that some words spoken by the river years ago could hold against even the fiercest storm. The night surged forward, louder and wilder, pulling them all toward a breaking point. And though she didn't know how it would end, she knew this was the moment everything had been building toward. The promise, the land, the fight height, was all about to collide. The valley held its breath, the river kept flowing, and the storm reached its peak. Climax was near, and the world they knew would never be the same once it broke. The fire burned long into the night, lighting up the valley like a warning to anyone watching from miles away. Smoke rose into the sky, carrying with it the bitter scent of loss. The barn was gone, reduced to embers and ash, but the ranch still stood. The cowboy, though weary and worn, stood at its center, unbroken. The Keatings had come with numbers and fury, but they had not expected the resolve they faced. Some fled into the hills when the fight turned against them, others lay wounded in the dirt, and the rest scattered before the first light of dawn. By sunrise, the ranch yard was quiet again, though nothing felt the same. She walked slowly across the blackened ground, her boots crunching over charred wood. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had seen. She had wanted to keep her promise, to prove that her words by the river mattered, but she had not expected the cost of keeping them. The night had shown her what it meant to stand beside him, not in dreams or in childhood vows, but in the harsh reality of fire and blood. And still, she did not regret coming back. The cowboy stood near the fence, his hat pulled low, his rifle leaning against the post. His shirt was torn, his arm grazed, but his eyes were steady. When she approached, he lifted his gaze to meet hers, and for the first time since her return, she saw the boy he once was flicker through. Tired, but alive. Hardened, but still there. "Shouldn't have been out here," he said, his voice rough from smoke and strain. She shook her head. "I told you I would be. 10 years ago I said I'd stand by you. I meant it." Silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was honest. He studied her face as though weighing the truth of her words against everything the night had taken. Then, slowly, he nodded. "And you did." The ranch hands gathered what they could salvage. The old hand, his face lined with exhaustion, moved with the same steady pace he always had. Fixing fences, clearing debris, refusing to let the place fall. The young boy, his hands still trembling from firing his first shots, worked without complaint, trying to hide the fear in his eyes.
Ow.
They were bruised and battered, but together they stood. The Keatings had not won, though the fight had left its mark. In the days that followed, the town spoke of the battle in hushed tones. Some said the cowboy was reckless. Others said he was the only man brave enough to stand against the Keatings. Whispers of the fire spread quickly, carried by travelers and wagons, until the story reached further than the valley itself. Yet for those who had lived it, the tale wasn't about glory, it was about survival. She stayed by the river during those days, watching the water roll steadily over rocks, the same as it always had. The land could burn, barns could fall, men could bleed, but the river kept moving. It reminded her of the promise, of the reason she had come back. She thought of the girl she had been at 8 years old, standing on tiptoe to kiss a boy and swear she'd return. That girl had no idea what the world could take from you, or how much it demanded when you tried to hold on to something. But she had been right about one thing: some promises were worth keeping. The cowboy came to her one evening, his steps slow, his shoulders heavy from days of rebuilding. Stopped at the water's edge, the same spot where they once carved their initials into the bark of a tree. For a while they said nothing, just listened to the steady current. Then he spoke. "When you left all those years ago, I figured it was just a child's vow. Something you'd forget when the world gave you other things to think about. But you didn't forget, you came back." His voice softened. "Because of that, I didn't have to fight alone." She turned to look at him, her heart tightening at the truth in his words. "I never planned to let you fight alone." The river carried their silence, wrapping it in its song. He reached into his pocket then, pulling out a small worn token. It was a piece of carved wood, rough and simple, shaped like a heart. "I made this when I was a boy. Always meant to give it to you, but you left before I found the courage. Kept it all these years." He held it out, his hand steady despite everything. Her throat tightened as she took it, her fingers brushing against his. It was more than what it was: proof that even in the years apart, he had remembered to. The valley slowly began to heal. Neighbors who had once stood at a distance now came to help rebuild, some out of gratitude, others out of respect. The Keatings retreated, their pride wounded, their threats quieter for now. No one knew if they would strike again, but for the moment, the land belonged to those who had fought for it. Life did not return to what it was before, because it couldn't. Scars remained on the land, on the people, on the memories of that night. But from those scars came something stronger. The cowboy, once hardened and closed, began to let her in, little by little. He still carried his silence like armor, but he no longer shut her out. She saw it in the way he asked her opinion, in the way his gaze softened when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way he stood closer to her when the nights grew long. She too had changed. She was no longer the girl who dreamed by the river. She was the woman who had walked through fire, who had seen the cost of her promise and chosen to bear it anyway. The valley had tested her, tested the vow she made, and though she carried new scars of her own, she stood stronger for it. As the seasons turned, the river kept flowing, steady as ever. The cottonwoods grew taller, their branches reaching higher into the wide western sky. And each time she stood by the water with him, she felt the story come full circle. She had kissed a cowboy by the river at 8 years old and promised to return. 10 years later, she kept her word. The world had tried to break that promise, with distance, with hardship, with fire and blood, but in the end, it had held. And as she stood beside him now, the promise no longer felt like a burden carried alone. It was shared, living not just in her heart, but in his. The boy she once knew was gone, replaced by a man forged by struggle, but the thread between them had endured.
Ow.
The river had remembered, the land had remembered, and so had they. The valley whispered its stories, the town carried on, and the ranch began to rise from its ashes. She knew there would always be storms, always be battles to fight, but she also knew she would not face them alone. The promise she had made was more than just words spoken by a child. It had become a life, a bond, a truth. And as the sun set over the land, painting the sky in gold and crimson, she understood that keeping that promise had not only brought her back to him, it had made her part of the land, part of the story, part of something unbreakable. The river flowed on, and with it carried the quiet certainty that some promises, no matter how small they begin, are meant to last forever.